Hey, the other day, can you guys all see this? Look what I got in the mail. I got 50 years of mainframe coin from our old buddies at BMC. Look at it.
Sweet.
It's in this attractive plastic case, and it has some sort of punch card action on the back. Can you see that?
Wow, well done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to consider what to do with this. Like, is this the kind of thing that I should spend some familial husband points to have on the mantle permanently?
I,
Definitely not.
I think if you crack it open, it frees the souls of the prisoners, just like in Superman.
Oh, oh, I see. There, what's his name? Zod? Is he in
Yeah,
there?
it's Zod, the original BMC mainframe programmer.
Yeah, no, but seriously, I do appreciate getting these little Chotskys things. And this is the first one, now that I'm back of being an analyst. I'd forgotten that when you're an analyst, they send you these things. It's kind of fun. When I was at my previous employer, people would never send me this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a good point. I'm going to put some glue on this to make sure Zod doesn't get out. That's definitely we don't want that.
Coach, I
So,
didn't know that you got these high class gifts. What's
I
the best gift you've gotten as an analyst?
well, I'm gonna as always, I'm gonna give you two categories of things, but instead of just giving you a simple answer. So I would say there are two of the most practical things that I've gotten. One, this past Christmas, or whatever you choose to celebrate, the wonderful people at SUSE sent me some nuts, and they were delicious. There was some cashews, some honey roasted peanuts, some peanuts, sort of a medley, and then some almonds. And almonds are a pretty boring nut, but I think you get luxury almonds, and they're interesting. And then the other one that I still use, we used this on a camping trip recently. I went to a Citrix analyst summit once, and they gave us a French press that was branded with Citrix, and that is the
Wow.
swag that keeps on giving right there. And that
Wow.
is,
That is
Wow.
swag.
That's actually pretty useful. That's actually
yeah,
I
yeah.
have to remember that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and then then usually it's just a bunch of gadgets and gizmos. Like I went to Google I/O one year, and you get like a Chromebook and a phone. It's
That-
like,
That's nice.
yeah,
I,
yeah. I
I
got a copy of Creative Suite once. That was awesome.
I got a Nexus One at Oscon a couple years back.
Ooh, yeah.
Hmm.
Let me ask. I'm considering going to Google I/O. They sent me an invite. I haven't figured out if I should go or not. I'm trying to figure out if it would be good, for me to attend just professionally, but sort of personally, I'm not sure. Like, this is you guys we're all sort of in the same age bracket. Like, are we too old to just get excited about free stuff under our chair, or is that something we should focus on?
I think they scaled back some of the free stuff though at Google I/O. Like
Mm.
you got early access to buy things. Because I think last year
Oh,
they had when they had the original glass. It was like, oh, you got to buy it before anybody else, but you still had to buy
oh
it.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
I mean the Nexus One, I got a free one when they were trying to get people to program on the Android, and then at the last at the OpenStack Summit, I in retrospect, I guess it wasn't the best piece of swag since that phone was because I used it for several years, but I got super excited about a cell phone charger. I was like,
Oh
wow, this
yeah.
is so super useful. And then,
Well,
of course,
well,
they
well.
had them at 5 different booths.
Were you at DevOps days? Look, I got like six of these from
I
our
did
friends
not
at
get one.
EA
Someone
Technologies.
took six.
Yeah, maybe I should be admitting that. But yeah, it's great. Like I have an old iPhone 4S, which means the battery lasts about 3 seconds. So I'm like constantly using those like some sort of like junkie. Like I'm just constantly plugging them in and meddling around with them. Like if a cop put his hands in my pocket, I had to be like, watch out, there's a battery in there.
Yeah,
Well, for
I,
what
I
it's worth,
got.
Cote, you should definitely go to Google I/O. You need to go, bring back
Okay.
the details. We want to hear about it. Maybe something new and exciting will happen, and you'll be on the scene.
Sure, on the scene. I'll get a hat. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll see. I'll see. I need to figure that out in the next 24 hours or so. Well, so speaking of conferences, Matt Ray and I were at the OpenStack Summit a couple weeks ago. We had a little break. I don't remember what happened last week. I don't know. We had a 451 conference I went to. But yeah, as usual, I mean, there's always seems to be. Tell me if you guys think otherwise. But there seems to be two things that happen at OpenStack conferences. There's three. There's three memes that always happen. One, we've got a new release of software, which is great, new stuff. And then 2, there's like, we've got some more users. And then the other side of that is always like, where are the OpenStack users? That's a constant meme. And then you can always depend on the OpenStack Summit for 1 to 3 squabbles between all of the vendors, in there. And I think all 3 of our punch list here was completely satisfied in the a couple weeks ago in the OpenStack Summit.
Well, I think the software releases, that's something that they kind of put that on the calendar, so you get one of those because, well, it was a month before the conference.
Sure.
And it is the design summit for the next one, so that's a given. The squabbles, I thought there was a higher content of squabbles this time.
Yeah.
Enjoyable.
Well, maybe to recap, what were the squabbles last time? At the Hong Kong one, was there anything? Any squabbling?
Man, you're asking
Obviously,
me
I don't.
Wayback Machine. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't I wasn't there, so for my benefit, give me what were the couple top squabbles this time?
So I think they all resolved basically around how open do you need to be, if I remember correctly, right? So one, HP released its OpenStack distro, released whatever, more stuff coming out, and called how do you pronounce it? Helion?
I think it's Helion.
Helion. There you go. Kim has this word my wife she uses she says Helion all the time, and so it's hard to get that out of my head.
I think that's spelled with 2 L's. It's not
well,
sure it's a great choice.
I've never been one to worry about how many L's are in a word. But anyways, so they released that, and there were some as one would say, closed source components. I guess people actually call them proprietary in there. Like I think the instead of using, what do they call it, Horizon, the UI level, they've got their own component, and there might be 1 or 2 other things. So immediately that opens up the old open core discussion.
Yeah.
Sort of like, woo! Without that Taurus Baylog guy being around, it's where'd he go? And then I think the other squabble was around. It looked like someone sort of like leaked to the Wall Street Journal or sent them some memo that Red Hat was not happy about supporting Red Hat Enterprise Linux on non-Red Hat OpenStacks.
Yeah.
And there's a fair amount of nuance around that. But though I think did I miss anything, Matt Ray? I think those were the 2 main squabbles that came up.
Yeah. So there was HP saying that they were open, and then you had Dell saying you guys aren't very open. And then there was the Red Hat memo that got leaked about their fight with Mirantis, which got conflated into Red Hat doesn't support any OpenStack but their own OpenStack.
Right.
And then I think HP and Dell came back around on Red Hat for that one, and Mirantis piled back in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And then you're going to need a reference card to track all the stuff that happened in a short amount of time.
We'll need a little. If you're this vendor, you want to kick those vendors because you're competing against them for who knows.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Isn't this the age-old open source argument, which really just degenerates back to like we're trying to figure out how to make money, and we don't know, and we're confused, and this is why I don't know. This just seems like where the whole group of vendors always start to like lose their way, right? Everyone starts to like argue about how they're going to try to make money, and then the whole thing just never advances forward. It seems like this happens in like every project, whether it's OpenStack or the myriad of projects before. So it seems like the same thing is just playing out again.
Well, I think it's worse in OpenStack. I don't know if it was Andrew Clay Schaefer who like pinned the meme or whatever that this is classic prisoner's dilemma, right? If we all cooperate, we'll all win. If we all work together on OpenStack shoulder to shoulder, it's gonna beat out the competition and whatnot. But if I screw you over in the short term, I win. And anyone who makes that choice screws over the rest of them. And there's some of that going on in OpenStack right now. I think HP had that blog post about Neutron, about the networking component.
I think it was Jack Clark. Well, I don't know if they had a blog post, but Jack Clark wrote it up in the Register, and they had some pretty direct words about not being happy with the networking in OpenStack, and trying to fix that up. Which, you know, being the I always aspire to be. I heard a joke about the half empty or half full glass the other day. That you were there, right, Matt Ray? And both of you were there. That was a good joke at the DevOps Days, Austin, about the glass is half empty or half full, or an engineer would say this vessel is larger than it needs to be, which I like the third option, but
I like that. I also like the opportunity. Pessimist sees it as half empty. The optimist sees it as half full, and the opportunist sees it as a chance to drink the other half.
That's right. That's right. And so, I always try to be a little opportunist in this view here, and that is, I mean, there's I think this whole discussion of let me back up. I always find the OpenStack community somewhat frustrating, right? Because and the reason it's frustrating, I think, is because it's figuring itself out, if you will, and because there's lots of different parties and, as you say, prisoners involved. And I think I was talking with one of the somewhat not too involved distro companies in that whichever way it goes is okay with them, essentially. And they, in having this discussion with them, they had an interesting framing with OpenStack that I think was nice. And I was complaining, it seems like OpenStack doesn't really want to be the Eclipse Foundation, and they definitely don't want to be the ASF, but there's some middle ground that they're kind of not quite as a community sort of all agreeing to. And it seems like de facto or ad hoc what they end up being is essentially sort of a pile of code that a bunch of vendors can come in and collaborate on and use, right? Which is sort of the intention of the Eclipse Foundation. But the Eclipse Foundation is a lot more specific about, we find all of the common code that's shared amongst our federation, if you will, and we basically commoditize and maintain that code that's really well, and then vendors come in, and if they want to, they can build commercial things on top of it. End of story, right? There's not a lot of, you don't really see a lot of arguments in the Eclipse Foundation about open versus open core or whatever. It's all pretty straightforward, and I feel like it would be wonderful if in the over the next year or however long it takes, if the OpenStack community kind of had a similar crystal clearness around, is it sort of like a library of stuff you go to use, or are we trying to build some GPL thing, right? And I think a lot of this persnicketyness and squabbling kind of amounts to the community as a whole not all agreeing to the same mission, if you will. And then also all the commercial interests that always come in. I mean, that's inevitable.
Well, I think does the Eclipse Foundation have a mandate for evangelism? And that's what kind of separates OpenStack from the ASF.
That's a good question.
I know that part of the OpenStack Foundation is encouraging other companies to adopt it, and going out of their way to find and evangelize it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Eclipse definitely has budget and resources for marketing and evangelism. I don't know if it's sort of
because Apache doesn't have much.
Yeah. I don't know if they have that George W. Bush Methodist writer going out into the plantation, portrait on their wall or whatever, into the West to evangelize. But yeah, I don't know. But it is sort of odd because you guys are at an interesting remove, right? You definitely work in the OpenStack world, but you work in the cloud world as a whole. I mean, do sort of this discussion of open core, how open things are, or swapping in your closed source stuff, does it really affect the way you guys exist in the cloud world?
Not on my side. I think it just kind of comes back to, there's all this infighting going on and, in that world, and it's, like I said, it's sort of outside of that, you have Amazon, Google, and, the public clouds, right, just marching on. And I think, again, it kind of comes back to that earlier comment I made around, what these groups never seem to do is kind of agree where they should compete and agree where they should work together, right? And it's sort of if everyone could kind of say, okay, we're going to work on this part together, and then we're going to allow us to compete in these other areas to make money, it would be much clearer, right? The rules of engagement would be much simpler. But
yeah,
it's this age-old, it's just how open source are you? Whenever that conversation comes up, it's almost, I just feel like I need to leave the room. Nothing at this point forward is going to help anyone. So I don't know, as I just look at the OpenStack group in general, right, it's sort of are they going to be able to figure that out? Because obviously, Google, Amazon, and everybody else is sort of just like marching on.
Well, and hasn't there been kind of a refutation of the need to highlight how open your cloud is? I know Rackspace has already started backing away from being the open cloud company, going back to fanatical support. That's where you make your bones. It's not the end user doesn't care.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think what people want is like to limit, let's call it proprietary debt in the future as much as possible, or lock in, or all of that stuff, right? And they, usually what they want is they want whatever platform they choose to continue evolving, and not like hold them at ransom to keep paying prices, and be easier to leave than not, if you will. I mean, and I yeah, that's a big meta question of like, do people really care about open source like at a high level? And it's increasingly like, obviously they care about open source, but it's not like the grand experiment of the early 2000s where it was sort of like being open source was a sort of like the French take on it. It must all be open source. I don't even know if they do that still. Like,
well, and I think there are a lot of companies that they're not thinking about how they switch between clouds. They're not nearly that advanced. They're at the stage of like, how do we get into the cloud? And being able to tell them this nice story about, oh, it's open and you can move from this one to that one. They're not that sophisticated yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it always comes back to me. It's like what the vendors and more importantly, I think what the software developers want the open source part to really be very meaningful. But really, when you look at it with customers, it's like maybe like the fourth or fifth thing on the list that they're really thinking about. And it's like, but that people kind of keep returning to it, like, oh, but look at this, and it's like, well, it's just not that important to me, right? It's not my top 3 priorities right now.
Yeah, maybe it's more of sort of like it's a list of 10 hygiene features people might aspire to, or customers might want, right? Like, there's other hygienic features that will make whatever choice you have good, and open source might be also hygienic for you.
Well,
or maybe not.
And it's probably also one of those things. It's a higher developer priority than a consumer priority, and that's been one of the problems for OpenStack in general. Is it's been very developer focused, which means, hey, of course, you want as much open source as you can when it's aimed at developers. But as a consumer, I'm more I care a lot more about operations. I care more about actually running this stuff in production and keeping it up, and how easy is it to use. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. And then what was the talk about? Was there a lot of talk about Amazon and Google Cloud while you guys are there? Or was that sort of not a big topic of conversation?
That it comes and goes. The Oracle lawsuit against Google definitely had a chilling effect about AWS conversations. With the last 2 summits, I guess there were conversations about how well should we support the AWS API. It was in the code, it was out of the code, it was back and forth, and the Google API was also contributed. But with the Oracle lawsuit against about the Java APIs, it's like, do we even want to bother supporting that?
Right, and then in summary, the Oracle lawsuit, if I remember, it's basically Oracle suing Google over Google making Dalvik, which is sort of a variant of Java that's used to run Android, right? And
yes.
and I forget, I don't know I'm not a lawyer, as they say, but essentially the point of Java, not the point, one of the constraints of Java way back when was that you had to comply with the APIs and pass the TCKs, the verification tests, and then you could make claims that you were a Java thing, if you will, and you were given rights to use as they say, the marks, the trademark and the copyright and things like that. And there were sort of, I don't know, I guess alleged technical shenanigans that Google did, and Oracle, being the owner of Java now since they bought Sun, was like, hey, let's sue you guys. And I guess basically the court found in Oracle's favor, right?
Yeah, it was like an appeals court found in Oracle's favor, but my understanding is Google never applied Dalvik to be to be a Java certified platform. They just happen to pass all the tests.
Exactly, and that's why it has this, as you say, chilling effect on AWS API compatibility. Because if I remember from some charts I saw of the last OpenStack community survey, like Amazon compatibility is actually pretty high up on modules people deploy in OpenStack. And in theory, it's a similar thing of like no one necessarily got permission from Amazon. No one thought they would need to get permission from Amazon to duplicate the APIs. So if those are indeed copyrightable, then there's sort of a problem on people's hands in the future.
Right. And I don't fully know how CloudStack and Eucalyptus have that sorted out. I think Eucalyptus has permission. And I think I think they both have like tacit permission, but there's no endorsement or something like that.
Yeah, that's what seems. I should, as a fancy pants analyst, I should know this better. But that's always what seems implicit in the copy and the press around all the Eucalyptus stuff, is that they've got a special relationship with Amazon. Just like you remember, SUSE used to always have, and probably still does, a special relationship with Microsoft when it came to doing, as we used to call it, heterogeneous systems management.
Yeah, so that lab's gone. That was at the Microsoft Compatibility Lab, and the guy who runs that, or who ran that from Novell's side, when the SUSE got bought and split up, whatnot, he changed nameplates on his desk and now works at Microsoft.
Oh, exciting!
Yeah, but he's the OpenStack Hyper-V guy, so he was there as always. And so when you talk about like the conversations at the summit about AWS and the Microsoft, there were quite a few conversations. The thing is, like, OpenStack is the software industry minus Google and Amazon.
Yeah.
And that's why nobody agrees with anything. They're all fighting.
Yeah.
And so it's like the only people not here are Amazon and Google. I mean, Microsoft's in the room. They're pushing Hyper-V. VMware's in the room. Cisco's there. Citrix is still there. So.
But I think that defines the whole problem, right? It's sort of like, they don't, by design, right? They're not there, and sort of, clearly Amazon's the leader, and so this is just what always comes back to like OpenStack, sort of just like you got to think the guys at Amazon are just like, this is great. Let these OpenStack guys infight forever, and meanwhile we're just gonna, continue to push the bar higher and higher while this kind of just goes on for years. Yeah.
I mean that's why I think, and I'm always advising people when they ask me, but I think they need to be crystal clear on the framing they have for stuff, right? Like, is this the way things are supposed to run, or is there something else? And there needs to be once you I read a long time ago that a strategy is only a strategy if you tell people about it. And so it's always good to whatever you think is the explicit intention to spell that out. And switching topics slightly, so you mentioned Hyper-V, which is an odd way of getting to the other thing, which I was quickly reading up about the whole Red Hat squabbling, and I think it's more or less cleared up, but it's still a little like not extremely clear. And to summarize, there was, as I mentioned, this was a second major squabble at the OpenStack Summit. There was again, it was a Wall Street Journal article that was sort of like, Red Hat does two things. One, supposedly they don't support Red Hat, RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, on non-Red Hat OpenStacks, and then two, they also don't like Mirantis. I mean, the second one, like, whatever, you can choose to like who you like and don't like, no big deal. But the first one was more, there was much, they used to say ink spilled, but there were many keys pressed over this, lots of characters typed, and I finally tracked down, like they actually sent it to us, again, being fancy pants analysts, like you can ask these questions, and there's a fact that is as direct as one can hope for on this, and it essentially says we will offer support for RHEL on certified OpenStack containers, if you will, and you can deploy RHEL on whatever OpenStack you want, and we can fully certify a stack if it's fully certified. And they made reference to the fact that they're certified to run on ESX and on Hyper-V, as sort of an example, if you will. Which, technologically and everything makes sense, right? And they explain this. Red Hat explained this in the three venues where there was a blog post, another sort of post somewhere in the FAQ. They're sort of like, so there's lots of permutations of software, and if you want us to support it all, we need to make sure we can support it, and we're not just going to give you a carte blanche, which technologically makes sense, but it does. Unfortunately, it's sort of a position that allows the squabblers to sort of make hay out of it.
Oh, sure.
Which is somewhat unfortunate.
Well, and OpenStack is really just the scheduler for your hypervisors across hypervisor, or for your VMs across hypervisors. So if you're running RHEL as the host with a RHEL packaged libvirt and KVM, who cares what the OpenStack layer is?
Right, exactly, and that was another good point that I think was, I guess so if you were running RHEL on a non-certified OpenStack scheduler, and I always hate the word scheduler because it makes me think of control M and batch job, which is not necessarily
it's
the right
same
thing.
Yeah,
exactly. At midnight, I want you to spin up 5 instances. I always think scheduling as in time instead of whatever, but yes. Anyways. So one could imagine that you have a uncertified scheduler that incorrectly deploys your RHEL instance, and I guess in that case, Red Hat would be like, well, your scheduler sucks, right? Like, what do you want?
I bet they don't even get those calls.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other story. But as far to your point, right? Once it's set up and running on a hypervisor, then I don't think it's that crazy to say we're only going to support down to the things that we certify and know about.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. This is always a hot topic in the monitoring space, isn't it, Brandon?
Well, no. At the end, right? It's how do you monitor all this? But again, I think it just kind of comes back to is this a legitimate problem? Are people really? I mean, maybe turn it back on you, Cote. You're the one out, talking to all the customers all the time. Are is this even this doesn't even sound like on the top 10 list of people that are issues that people are really concerned about when they're doing it, right? So it sounds like just something interesting to write about if you're the Wall Street Journal or whoever trying to just
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the early days of the OpenStack and cloud market in general, right? So the more interesting thing that this provokes is a question of, so what exactly am I supporting if I'm supporting a cloud, right? To do it in reverse, Red Hat's not, if you're running SAP on top of Red Hat, they're not going to support that, right? I mean, they'll support their section and they'll support the operating system and maybe JBoss if you're using that or whatever they call it nowadays. But it's there's no expectation that if you move up stack, they're going to support it. And I think similarly, it's not always too clear in the market. The people that I talk with about this, it's very unclear exactly what cloud is from vendor to vendor or option to option, right? So I think there's more confusion about it, and it highlights the need to be a little more specific about it, right? I remember there used to be I used to be in meetings, where we would talk about cloud, and one person was always like, "But what's the disk? Give me the disk." And they had a good point, right? It was sort of we were talking very abstractly about private cloud and OpenStack this and other options, and they just wanted to know where's the thing? Where are the boundaries of it, and what do I draw around it? And again, by design, I don't think it's designed to be that simple. And and then so whenever something's confusing, getting paid to support that, you have to be very cautious. You're not just going to run out and do anything. And also to Matt Ray's point, there's not a tremendous amount of OpenStack out there. There's lots of POCs and running instances, but it's not incredibly mainstream at the moment.
Which to me, coming back to your, the whole thing about the conference, which seems if you're at the conference, that's probably the number one problem, right? The number one problem is hey, we don't have enough people adopting this and using it in the real world, right? And we've got to and then we've got to nail down what it is we want to compete on, what it is that we want to charge on, and then we got to really get, the competition really is Google and Amazon, and how do we get those guys going? So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of an historical example of maybe it is. Maybe it's all the way back to Linux or something where people did unify at some point and it did become really viable and something to be taken seriously. And it's just, I don't know, when you look at OpenStack now, I'm more pessimistic than I am optimistic about it.
So do you guys like do you have customers, Brandon, that are like monitoring OpenStack things, or when does OpenStack come up that much, or is it more other cloud platforms and just
I mean,
good old-fashioned SSH?
Yeah, we have, it depends, like who you're talking to. I mean, we definitely have customers that are talking about it and they have big, grandiose visions. And of course, our for us, it's very simple, right? We're happy to monitor. It's something we can do pretty easily, so we're all for it. But it isn't something, like I said, it isn't kind of the day-to-day volume that I see. The day-to-day stuff I see is like, yeah, obviously people moving to like things like Amazon or some other cloud providers, just because it's much more tangible, right? They can log on, they can go set up their accounts, they can start testing something. They almost always have pilot projects going, so it's all just very much more real, right? And it's sort of like much, if you will, maturity-wise, it's much more mature in what the customer's trying to do, and they're like ready to do something, and they have a problem, and they've got money, and they know how they're doing it. And so from from a vendor perspective, right, it's easy to do business that way. When someone kind of comes to you and says, well, I'm thinking about OpenStack and I'm going to build this big, huge thing, and could you monitor it? It's like, well, sure we could, but they're just not, they're not really there yet. They're not really doing it yet.
Right. Yeah.
We're a little farther up the adoption curve. So several of the public clouds that are using OpenStack are deployed with Chef. Lots of private cloud deployments of it as well. The user survey showed about 20% of the deployments out there done with Chef. So like Bloomberg and SAP were talking about it at the conference. HP Public Cloud, but the thing is, it's still hard to use. And when I talk with folks about deploying OpenStack, I usually ask them, like, have you chosen a vendor? Because I don't think it's something that end user shops should be deploying for themselves. Unless that's their bread and butter. I mean, unless you are an IT shop.
That's definitely the advice that I give people. I get a lot of inbound inquiry, if you will, that's sort of, to grossly simplify it, that's like, so we're redoing our data center. Can you talk for 60 minutes about that? or 30, depending on what people want to, how they want to spend their time. But it is like, the advice I tend to give people is exactly what Matt Ray said, is like, if you want to do OpenStack, pick a vendor, right? Like you're going to need some help. And in fact, I still come across people who have sort of like built, they've gone to Home Depot and ended up with a weird cabinet, and they need to call in the professionals.
And they're definitely, like, I spent a lot of time talking to a bunch of the different vendors while I was there, because I have customers, they're a chef shop, but they want to know what their options are around, OpenStack vendors, deploying it for themselves, or going straight to the public cloud, and so talking with the different vendors, they're all bagging on each other, of course, because prisoner's dilemma, and then there's the whole like, oh well, we're cleaning up that company's mess. Or we've cleaned up 4 of that company's messes. So
and to be optimistic, if you will, which I think is much warranted. Like, so there was an analyst day they had at the OpenStack Summit, and they very nicely paraded all sorts of end users and customers in front of us, right? And they just completely opened it up for us to ask them questions and talk with them. So I think I don't know. I mean, if I were to summarize it, I think I would be pretty comfortable with the amount of adoption you see in OpenStack for the maturity it's at the moment. Like, there's actually a fair amount of people, mostly through vendors, as Matt Ray and I were talking about, who are using OpenStack and doing things with it. So, it actually seems to be doing well. It's just more when there's overhype about it, sort of like it being a disk, if you will. That's when dangerous things start happening. I mean, so you've got to just have a good understanding of, like, it is what it is, right? Like, it's not Linux in 2014. It's Linux in the early 2000s, essentially.
Right, and Linux had several years to grow off in the public eye wasn't focused on it. OpenStack showed up and like, hey, we're here to run your public cloud. Bring it on, Amazon, and that was 3 years ago.
That's right. So speaking of hype, how about this DevOps thing? Is that a thing?
No, that's a good question. That's a good analyst question.
You have no idea how many reports I would like to just call is blank a thing. Like, and in fact, maybe I should just found sort of a research track at 451 called "Is it a thing?" And that'll be the only report that I'll write over and over.
Maybe that should be the ongoing title of this series.
Is that a thing?
OpenStack, is that a thing? Next week can be, hybrid cloud. Is that a thing?
That's right. Less facetiously, I have this. I took a good tip from someone, and what you're supposed to do is have one. I think it was Matt Ray, among other people, who said every year you need to have one or two talks that you give. And so I have like a DevOps talk that I think at this point I can give in my sleep. And really, the only concern I have now is making sure I tell the good jokes that I've come up with over and over again, and still remember to laugh at them. It's quite.
Was that your OpenStack talk?
Yeah. That's the DevOps talk.
That's up on the YouTube, so put it in the show notes, of course.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a 30-minute version that I send in from DevOps Days Austin that I think is much better. It's shorter. I know Brandon probably wants a 2-minute version.
Yeah, definitely.
I think 30 minutes is about as short as I can do it. Like it's a problem. But so you I didn't get a chance to read it yet, but you sent over an article that sort of one of the many princes of DevOps, Gene Kim, wrote, Brandon. And what did our friend Gene Kim say?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Gene Kim, I think he was the founder of like Tripwire, and so he sold that off a while ago, and it's done well. And I was, like you said, he's certainly an advocate and always writing about it. So I guess what struck me is sort of this discussion that goes on all the time. So he wrote something, I think it was printed in the Wall Street Journal. So it's certainly a little bit more mainstream. It's not like in the weeds, but it was funny because in the end, right? It's like kind of like all the successful entrepreneurs, like when they start writing, they just kind of like de facto write about culture again, right? So like it was just about like DevOps, right? About like, hey, and he really just kind of calls out, I think he even has some line in there like, nothing guarantees success. Or, you don't have to do DevOps, but nothing guarantees success, or you're going to stay around. And I think his whole point is talking about kind of the classic command and control structure of a company versus the more grassroots, whether it's agile or DevOps. So it's just interesting to me because it's the same thing that just plays out. Again, I think over and over, right? It's like, yeah, we should be more decentralized and push the decision making down, and this is how a large company needs to do business. This is how they're going to succeed. But it also like comes across to me more and more as like naive, like, well, you're just going to write about that, and you didn't really offer any specific ways to improve that, or like give me a path to success, which sort of like I think is like the constant critique of DevOps, right? Is sort of like it's culture, but like what does that mean, right? So, so it's just interesting. I don't know if it's like at a tipping point, or maybe it's already gone by. I know like a lot of the DevOps guys, or even at that DevOps day we were all at a few weeks ago, people are sort of tired of talking about the culture and don't want to have that discussion anymore, right? It's sort of like so like what's left then, right? Is it just like another way to do to configure everything and organize your team, or is there something real there?
I think there's some fatigue among people who've been on the DevOps bandwagon for a while. Like we throw myself into the group, we kind of get it, and we see like there's resistance to it, and you can try to fight the resistance, or you can just go off and make more awesome for yourself. And I think there's some of that happening where people are like, hey, if you don't get it, that's fine. Keep on trucking, and eventually we'll run you over.
Yeah.
I definitely see that. I mean, I've heard talks that essentially say that, and I think that's in Gene Kim's talk. It's like, or in the article it says, you might not believe in evolution or whatever, or learning is not compulsory, but neither is survival. Right? So, yeah, it's hard to put your hands around what DevOps is, and a column in the Wall Street Journal isn't going to solve it for you. But there's a reason a lot of successful shops and unsuccessful shops are moving towards it, because the alternative isn't working.
Yeah.
And and if you are in the alternative, you're going against Walmart, you're going against Amazon, you're going against the new giants.
Yeah, I first of all, I'd say like that sort of a Project Phoenix book that he and the other folks have is actually pretty good when it comes to the culture process part. Like as with any work of fiction, it can be frustrating because it's sort of like as you turn the page, the problem gets solved, right? Like, but but it does, like, I remember when I was reading that, I felt like I was suffering some sort of white collar post traumatic stress syndrome, right? Like there's so many like episodes in that book where like, oh, I've been in that meeting, that's terrible, and like it makes you relive all these things, and at a certain point, there's always an issue in culture and process change where it gets to this point of like, well, do you want to do it or not, right? Like it's not going to be easy. You got to show up and do stuff that's difficult and do things differently, which is the annoying part. And what becomes tedious for old timers about this conversation is you're not supposed to obsess over tools and tactical things, right? Because it's sort of like a broader philosophic thing. But there's this effect where like new people really just want to know, tell me what to do, tell me the tools and the tactics and the technologies, right? And you're like, no, that's wrong. And then I think also like as you become like hardened to like this, as you become the people like who know what agile infrastructure was the first term for DevOps and all this stuff, you kind of become the same way. You're just like, just tell me what to do, right? Like I'm tired of talking about culture and change and why you need to do this. And it is. That's why I tend to focus so much on like DevOps toolchain stuff, because it's at least there's plenty of culture talk elsewhere, but culture does, obviously in the surveys and studies we do, which I could go on and on about, like that always comes up. But it does make me think. There's a rare opportunity. There's usually not three of us in the same room, virtual otherwise, but didn't we like go through the same thing back when we were switching over to Scrum in the early 2000s?
Like the Agile? Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's sort of some extensive cases that were written up about that when we were at a former employer and at BMC under Israel Gatt. But I feel like it was kind of the same thing. Like, there was a whole bunch of like culture talk and process stuff, and there were even tools. And at the end of the day, it was sort of like everyone had to look at each other and they were like, so, are we going to do this?
Right.
Or not? Like,
and I was at a couple of different Agile conferences earlier this year, and there's people still having that conversation.
Yeah.
And to us, it's like that's decided, right? That's ancient history. But no, that's still a thing. There's.
What's Mike Jugg's new series on HBO? Can't remember.
Like Silicon Valley or whatever.
Yeah. It's funny because like unfortunately I have not seen it, but they were joking about how like the last episode had like the burn down charts and and it just like to me it just showed like how mainstream it had become, right? It was a sort of like they were just making a lot of jokes about it and all the Scrum and the stand up meetings and all of that. So I don't know. Yeah, I just feel like that's all settled ground, right? And it's like I don't know. In some ways, Agile offers the good. To your point, maybe that conversation about people still adopting it's out there, but it also feels like it's sort of been co-opted at this point, and for better or for worse, it is what it is. People kind of know what it is, and there's the often Waggle fall, right? Kind of the jokes people make. They've just sort of slammed the old process into it. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with like DevOps, like does it like really break through? Because I mean, a lot of those concepts in Agile have broken through and have taken hold, but a lot of it is sort of got lost too.
I think it is breaking through. I mean, when I see, obviously I'm deep inside the bubble, where I work.
You are the bubble.
Yeah, but when I see like, Best Buy and Target and Macy's and Nordstrom and all these traditional retailers who their lunch money was stolen and now they're reinventing themselves because what else are they going to do? They either go bankrupt like all the toy companies did when Walmart ran them over, or they have to adapt. And if you don't adapt, you die. It's just that simple. And retail is the most visible place that happens. And the industry, I mean, just because their margins were already low, but it's going to happen to everything.
Yeah.
And if they don't, oh well. Amazon is coming.
Well, the thing, I agree with that. I mean, I do think though, like going forward, it's sort of like clearly in the automation in your world, right? I think, it's almost, rightfully or probably wrongfully, right? Like DevOps and automation tools are sort of like go hand in hand, right? I mean, I think that's where people usually, that's like the normal entry point. Maybe to Cote's point, that's the tool chain entry point. So, I mean, it's no doubt that that's, the way of the future, right? Now, whether or not, because I've chosen Chef or one of the other Puppet or what other automation tools, like does that mean I've really embraced it all? Maybe not, but that's clearly going to be the wave of the future, right? I don't think there's any going back. I don't think anyone's like, oh no, go ahead.
It feels like, looking back to like Agile and Scrum, right? Like the successful movements, and success is never 100%. It's just sort of like, it sort of just gets in the water supply here and there, and then people also don't like fluoride, so or whatever. But eventually it's mainstream enough that you kind of stop talking about it. And it seems like what happens is there's always culture coupled with a few tactics and tools, right? So in something like Agile, like unit testing became a big deal, and that sort of like helped drive something. And then just it was sort of like unit testing and the idea that you would have a more or less that you would have iterations. That was about it. Like everything else was sort of like optional details here and there. But the idea that you would orient your delivery schedule around 2 to 4 weeks instead of big windows, and then doing a lot of unit testing and otherwise, that seemed to sort of like propel all the notions of Agile into a thing you could actually do, and probably also created all the Wagile fall and slacky things, right? And in contrast, it wasn't XP, which is very prescriptive and had all this stuff, right? It was just sort of like, here's a few practices we can do, and then we're doing an Agile thing. And it seems like you mentioned in DevOps, like there needs to be that emerging, my theory would be that emerging coupling of culture and tactics and tools, if you will, and definitely the way you do your automation, whether it's like with all the new automation vendors, or even something wacky like Docker or a combination thereof, or something like, there's something about the way you package things up, and you want to package things the same throughout all the stages. And then the other thing, just to throw something out there, is like that Kanban thing looks pretty useful, right? It's I've experimented in a white collar context with using Trello, like Kanban ways of doing stuff, and it's really like, it's hard to explain to people, but like once you do it, they sort of get it, right? They get the idea of, I always think of it as an information radiator, and like having your team manage their self more. And at least in white collar work, a few people, like when you're working on PowerPoints, basically, they're like, oh right, this is much better than email, right? And it does seem like in the IT world that like there's increasingly this understanding that like we should use these Kanban boards. Like that's a helpful way of doing
I think
stuff.
that's even like advanced usage though. When
Sure.
the talk I gave at DevOps Days Austin, the operations maturity model thing, like afterwards I had so many people come up and tell me like, oh, I mean, the quick synopsis of the talk is like, hey, here's what you could be doing, and here's here's a roadmap, and you can figure out where you are on these different axes. It's just a big spreadsheet, right?
Yeah.
But so many people are like, our company has never even talked about postmortems, so they're not even on the map, And Kanban is like, that's way off to the right. That is like, oh, now that you understand all these concepts, you have a model in your mind of what you could be doing. Here's how we do that faster.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like the maturity of using all the automation stuff is much greater. Well, I actually haven't looked at this, but I would assume it's much greater than Kanban use. Like I'm sure we could get number of accounts in Trello or whatever, which is some unicorn land stuff, but whatever. But there is like ServiceNow just introduced like Kanban boards in their upcoming release. So that'll be interesting to see how that propagates out. But I think I guess the point I'm trying to make when it comes to something like Agile or DevOps or these big things, like you need to have like this kind of go big or go home mentality of like, sure, Kanban's like way out there, or like doing this wacky way of automation stuff is way out there, but like the payoff has to be so big that you're going to go through all the pain of switching to it. And it's interesting to noodle on and think about what would those 2 or 3 big bets that you would make, in order to like propel yourself into DevOps to sort of make it painful. And again, I don't know if Kanban necessarily does it, but it also, like I've been reading that Clay Christensen and Co book. It's basically like, what's it called? How are you going to measure your life or something? Which is an interesting sort of like self-help book written as a business book. Not that I need self-help. I just like to get refreshed. But anyways, he has an interesting way of doing. He like all good business book writers, he states the obvious, and you have to remind yourself that unless it were stated so clearly, it wouldn't be so damn obvious.
Yep.
But like he says, whenever you're doing scenario planning, you need to ask the question, what needs to be true for this to work, if you will. And I think if you apply that to Kanban boards, it's kind of like the amount of information transparency and leveling of project management that a Kanban way of doing things enables is sort of necessary for DevOps to work, right? Like maybe that's not the exact way you need to do it, but the effect of being able to see everything at once and have everyone collaborate around it is definitely something you need for DevOps.
What you just said has so much culture wrapped into it. Transparency, sharing.
I agree.
I mean, breaking down silos.
And that's why in my limited experience in the white collar knowledge working world of applying Kanban, I think I hear the gears clunking in people's heads, because it's not even so much that they don't want to be transparent, they just don't understand why that would matter. Right? They're just sort of like, I don't know, you emailed me 2 weeks ago that you need this chart and you need it 2 weeks from now. I'll give it to you 2 weeks from now. And you're like, no. Like, I used to be a programmer. That does not work. Right? Like I'm not going to wait 2 weeks, and then you're going to give me something 6 hours before I need it. No.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And that simple way of thinking about stuff, anyways, I talked about this on another podcast the other day, but it's just like in the white collar world, people don't think like that. They don't think in this to use another cultural thing, they don't assume failure. Right? And they don't succeed by failing a lot. Like, and I don't know how they operate. They use Outlook or something.
But I think you really are right, Cote. It's funny you mentioned that, because I think email, right, the tool drives interactions, right? And the tool is so ingrained, I don't think we can even see anymore that how much the tool drives the interactions in our day-to-day. We just can't see past email. Like the belief that, like, could you start a company and not have email and just not do it? What would people do?
It's sort of like if that McLuhan guy in Conway had a baby. It would be sort of like the tools you use define your product, right? Like the message and the communication paths of the organization define the architecture of the product. Look how smart I am. But anyways, definitely, and it's so frustrating. But I think you're right that like time and time again, any group that I work in, no matter what industry or what type of work they're doing, like it tends to be the case more than not that the tool chain that they use completely defines the quality and the way that they do their work. There's really no way around it.
Well, then what about the fact that the tool chain that we use changes so frequently? I mean, just to have like these communications. Before we got on, we were complaining about Google Hangouts, and we were using Skype before and IRC and instant messaging.
I think that gets to your point of the software-defined business imperative. And you like that phrase, imperative, where like the nature of your business is changing so much that if you use the old tools, the nature of your business isn't going to change fast enough.
Exactly.
So, now to that end, I'm not going to skip up on a chance to rant against the user experience in Google Hangouts, which I find appalling and awful.
It'll change. Don't worry.
That's right, but it's like the weather in Texas and every other state. It'll change if you don't like it. But that said, I use it constantly, so actually it's a net positive. And speaking of net positives, this is an exciting first episode.
Like getting up on the edge of my seat.
So we were going to hold the introduction to the last, but in case you haven't figured out, Brandon and Matt and I have been talking about starting a podcast for quite some time, and as if I don't have enough podcasts that I do, I thought I would start a new one, and we were going to call it Software Defined Talk, just because we only have so long to come up with a name.
There was only so many monkeys, and that's what they came up with.
And also, I stupidly was going to register softwaredefinedtalk.io, but Matt Ray, hopefully, he pointed out that softwaredefinedtalk.com was available. So I saved myself probably $45. Like, I don't know why that IO stuff is so expensive, but so you can go to our page at softwaredefinedtalk.com, and I, of course, am Michael Cote. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, hi, I'm Brandon Witcher, and I'm the Director of Product Management at Boundary. So if you're interested in monitoring something, come over to boundary.com and we'll help you out.
This is Matt Ray from Chef. I'm the Director of Partner Integration. So if you have something you'd like to do with Chef, I can probably help you out.
You can integrate partners and
Yes.
partner integration alliances. It's very exciting. Yeah. So you know we have a nice mixture of stuff here. Me being an industry analyst, sort of flitting about the world, talking with people. Matt Ray doing partnering stuff, and Brandon working in this sort of like, what would you call it? The required thing for all. It's the hammer for all of IT, monitoring and performance management. Like, you know. I think as Socrates said, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it.
That's right. That's right.
That was
Absolutely.
Socrates.
I'm sure it was
Yeah.
Socrates. Absolutely.
He also said, "Don't retweet me, bro."
And as I recall, he was also railing against the written word in one of his strolls around the castle. So take everything that Plato wrote, Socrates said, with a grain of salt. Not the sharpest stick when it comes to the technology world in the quiver.
Yes.
Fear the written word. It shall change you, brother. Now where's the olive oil? So yeah, once I get this uploaded, I'll be able to submit it to iTunes. But in the meantime, there's a FeedBurner thing you can subscribe to. But just go to softwaredefinedtalk.com and you'll get all your stuff. And really, the only reason I start so many podcasts is so I can beguile Matt Ray with all the feeds that he needs to subscribe to.
He
No, he
broke
always
my
has a problem.
iTunes. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, with that, we'll see everyone next time.